of computer games innovation. And here's another one to add to the list. Homegrown in Nottingham, it's Timesplitters.
Free Radical designs were riding high in 2004. The UK-based studio, formed primarily of ex-Rare developers, had taken the knowledge gained from changing the console shooter landscape with 1997's GoldenEye and applied it to a new IP, Timesplitters. Timesplitters found commercial and financial success in late 2000 when it launched as a console exclusive for the then brand new PlayStation 2.
Although PlayStation 2 was released yesterday, you'll be lucky to find one in the shops. Due to high demand and shortage of supplies, most people will have to wait until after Christmas for the latest in games technology.
I think the PlayStation 2, for me as an animator, it takes me one step further to producing what I'd really like to produce.
It'll do an awful lot of stuff that people haven't seen before. It won't make your toast for you in the morning, but it'll do an awful lot of other clever things.
2 years later, in 2002, Timesplitters would go from solid launch title to established IP, with its sequel, the aptly named Timesplitters 2, which was released this time across all major platforms. Even more than the first, Timesplitters 2 would see huge success, both with gamers and critics, scoring 9s and 10s across the board, and outselling the original game by vast amounts. But while Free Radical would continue the franchise that put them on the map a few years later in 2005, with Timesplitters Future Perfect, in between, they'd try their hand at another game, with the supernatural stealth thriller Second Sight.
Second Sight, out now on PlayStation 2, Xbox, and GameCube.
Interestingly, Second Sight had originally been planned as the studio's first game, but was ultimately deemed a little too ambitious for a release title on what was then brand new hardware. Originally titled Redemption, Second Sight would percolate in the background at the studio before eventually shifting into full development after Timesplitters 2. By this time, however, much of the team had perfected working on a very different kind of game, and the development of Second Sight was not an easy or smooth process. A fact reasonably well hidden in this informative yet hilarious making-of documentary, which seems hellbent on distracting the viewer with early 2000s ghost hunting show vibes.
As you walk along in your average day, there is much you take for granted. The clothes on your back, your everyday journey from A to B, even your identity. Now stop for a second and imagine what it would be like if you woke up one day and all that was gone. Your name, your identity, everything that forms the fabric of your life.
There was certain sections of the game where we decided that in terms of the path timeline, the first couple of levels, you wouldn't have access to the psychic powers. It would be a bit of a surprise as you got through to it.
First of all, there was the kind of idea of having flashbacks. And that was really, the flashback idea started because we wanted to have some kind of interactivity in.
I mean, it's kind of great though, right? It's kind of like the filmmaker had only worked on Most Haunted before this.
Mary loves Dick. Mary loves Dick.
When it finally released in 2004, it was met with largely positive critical reviews and sold well enough, developing somewhat of a cult following in the years that followed. For a while, after Free Radical hit financial troubles and got bought out twice, changed their name to Crytek UK and back again, Second Sight was actually delisted from digital storefronts, meaning old physical copies were the only way to play. However, after Free Radical were acquired by THQ Nordic, the game has now been relisted and is available again on Steam and GOG, although it seems no effort has been made to patch or update it. So unless you're planning on playing on original hardware or through emulation, there's a little work that's required to get it running. So let's start there, shall we? While I ended up playing the Steam version, it seems there's no difference between it and the GOG version other than of course the DRM. On initial load, the game ran like absolute arse. Choppy frame rate, no modern resolution support, desynced sound and crashes all over the place. At first, I considered switching to the PlayStation 2 version. However, because I grew up in merry old England, the version I bought back when I still had hope that my life would turn out okay, is locked to 25 frames per second on PS2 due to the 50Hz PAL limitations, which isn't ideal. Returning to the PC version, some quick alterations in the config file fixed a lot of the issues, although not all of them. You can set the resolution up to 4K and fix the frame rate here, but it takes a little more fiddling to get the controls working, and even then, they're never perfect. You can alter them in the config file or use Steam's handy rebind mode and get them to a usable, if not ideal state. That's pretty much the console experience. I personally downloaded a layout from the Steam controller mapping system that worked pretty well. Although it is worth noting that when aiming, either down the scope or at distance, I still often used the mouse, as it was absolute hell with the analog stick. Overall, the PC version is stable-ish after these changes, and I think there are a few more mods out there if you go looking, but it still has a few bugs and issues, some of which have always been there, and others that seem to be tied specifically to this port. I also had a few crashes, so that's fun, especially when you consider that checkpoints are very spaced out, and also don't save if you quit out manually after you get frustrated and fancy taking a break. So have fun playing the entire mission you were on again from the start. So that's the game sort of running well, so let's talk about the story. This section of the video is actually going to be the briefest, which is ironic as Second Sight's story is by far its best feature, but it's exactly because of that fact that spoiling any part of it would be to the game's detriment. Normally I'd just put a spoiler warning and dig in depth, but with this game it really is best to go in as blind as possible. All you need to know is you play as a man who wakes up in some kind of institute with no memory of his past or how he got there. Dazed and confused, he soon realises that he seems to have some sort of psychic and telekinetic abilities, and is also plagued with strange visions that seem, at first at least, to make little sense. I'll leave it there, and I'll also try and avoid using too much footage that would spoil anything. I know it seems like a rote and formulaic opening premise that you've probably seen a million times before, and I guess it kind of is, but where this game takes that concept is worth experiencing for sure. It's not hyperbole to say that, in all the stories I've experienced across all the media I consume, I'm not sure I've ever seen an idea like this executed in this kind of way, and that's quite a feat. If you're watching this video and have played the game before, then you probably know what I'm talking about, but for those of you that haven't, try and keep away from any spoilers. Isn't this game like 20 years old?
Well, that's it for part 1, but don't go anywhere, because after the ads, we'll be back with some super strong Shaolin monks. Brief, show us what it means to rock, and we'll be giving you the rundown of our latest news. See you in a minute.
However, with all of that said, I will say that there are quite a few moments when the game fails to deliver its ideas well enough for them to have maximum impact, and there's also a fair bit of convenience and use of plot devices here. It's basically a fantastic core idea and concept for a structure that needed better connective tissue to tie it all together. Also, unfortunately, even experiencing the best parts of this interesting narrative with all its twists and turns might be harder than it seems, especially for modern gamers, because Second Sight's gameplay, well, it's complicated. So let's talk about the positives first. Second Sight is primarily a stealth game. Your objectives usually involve getting from one place to another without alerting any guards or letting anyone know you were there. Mixed in with these, more regular objectives are a handful of more action-focused missions, but we'll come back to those in a little bit. At the start of the game, your arsenal of psychic tricks is limited, but as you progress, new abilities unlock and slowly you become a real force to be reckoned with. From telekinesis to healing to invisibility to flinging enemies around, most of the powers are fun and interesting, even if I used some of them way more than others. While there are some standard abilities for sure, there are definitely some original ideas here that can make the gameplay super fun. But no matter how overpowered the ability is, and how great it is to use, the experience is unfortunately intermittently marred with problems that are almost always nothing to do with the player. Movement can be stiff and awkward, targeting is fraught with issues, enemy AI is very, very inconsistent, sometimes seeing you when you definitely should be hidden, and other times allowing you to walk straight past without them even noticing. Also on this score, I've noticed that a lot of the time, if you tried to get past an area in ways that the game didn't want you to, then all of the enemies would just be alerted to your presence, even if there was no way they could have seen where you were. It's weird because the game sets itself up and plays like it wants to be an immersive sim, having the player utilise their powers in clever ways to get past obstacles. But then it turns out that there's usually only one way the game wants you to do things, and if you don't do it that way, you'll fail or be killed. Perhaps the intent was to craft something a little more like Deus Ex, but the hardware limitation and troubled development made that impossible. I'm just not sure. It's also worth mentioning that such inconsistencies also rear their head in the mission design, which can be great, just okay, or an absolute nightmare depending on which mission you're playing. And all of this is only compounded further by the checkpoint issues I mentioned earlier on. The two main reasons for these inconsistencies, though, are the reliance on wonky AI for both friend and foe, and an often present lack of direction for the player. Personally, I welcome explorative gameplay, and I yearn for the days before minimaps, objective markers, and the like. But the trouble with Second Sight is it can often make you feel like you should be able to do something that's just not working properly, when actually the game wants you to be doing something else entirely. For example, there's a part in one of the missions where you have to get past a street gang while also avoiding some government agents in order to meet up with an NPC inside of an apartment building. Technically, there's no reason why you shouldn't be able to just use your invisible power and walk right past the gang, and bear in mind that the game has set up that this should be possible too. Hell, you've been using this same ability and tactic in almost all the missions before this since it unlocked, to accomplish very similar or even the same goal. But whenever you try this method, all the NPCs just instantly know where you are, and turn hostile, even if you still have the invisibility power active. Or worse, the ability will just fail with no narrative or gameplay explanation, meaning everyone can see you again and your power is completely drained. It's so frustrating that it does this. What could have been the setup for an interesting obstacle that made the player feel clever when they solved it using a variety of abilities instead devolves into a frustrating exercise in troubleshooting to find the solution that the game had in mind, not the person playing it. This is just one example, and there are a few missions that were so frustrating I almost gave up on this review completely. Seriously, I don't even want to talk about the rescue. And then there's the camera. Oh man. So there are two camera modes here. A locked mode, which positions the camera for you, and a free mode, which allows you to move the camera yourself. The problem is, this is a third-person stealth game, and because you so often need to see all the possible threats that surround you, the fixed camera is usually far too limiting, making it impossible to see a guard out of sight around a corner or behind where the camera is stationed. So go for the free camera mode, right? Well, unfortunately, the free camera mode is kind of broken, and will get caught on terrain, correct at the worst possible times, just refuse to move if it encounters collision, or occasionally go absolutely mental. Honestly, it's sometimes so infuriating. On top of all of this, it can often be hard to tell when you'll be seen or heard by enemies, and what constitutes being shrouded in darkness. Compounding all of this even more are some baffling gameplay design choices that unfortunately only serve to make the experience more frustrating. Like, for example, the fact that you'll stand up after using a stealth ability or pressing a switch. This means that if you are in cover, you'll potentially now be seen instantly. None of this is helped by a control scheme that's a little bit strange. Button assignment is not traditional, and the aforementioned aiming system was almost unusable in places without mouse input, although I can't speak to how it plays on the console version. On the flip side though, if you do use the mouse to aim, it literally breaks the game. I know all of this sounds harsh, but the ultimate irony here is that when things do come together, and a section of the game works as intended, it's so original, clever, and fun to play. But that just makes the times where it doesn't work even worse. If it was a true immersive sim with all the elements correctly executed, better AI, and a better camera, this game would go down as one of the all-time greats. And you can almost feel an amazing game trapped inside Second Sight, trying to fight its way out as you play, occasionally making itself known and then disappearing behind a frustrating mechanic, bug, or issue. The more action-focused missions mentioned earlier fare a little better, even if they're a little bit more bland. It kind of feels like they're lacking in the original ideas that are sometimes seen in the other missions, but are overall more confidently executed by a team that understood shooting and action-based design more than stealth and sneaking. In terms of presentation, Second Sight retains the very distinctive look seen in the Timesplitters series, but goes for a slightly darker, dirtier, drearier tone. This works well, but can be inconsistent at times, with some levels looking way better than others. Also, this inconsistency can occasionally affect gameplay, with the aforementioned shadows often being a little difficult to discern. However, I will say that the console version definitely has a less washed out and much darker look compared to the PC version, which I personally think looks a lot better and more distinctive. So it's possible some of the style has been washed out in the port and the change to higher resolutions. Animations are also a mixed bag tonally, and it's sometimes hard to know if they were going for like the Looney Tunes or the Manchurian Candidate. Still, on the plus side, look how you move downstairs. Oh my god. I actually thought this was broken at first, but it turns out it's not. This really is the stair animation. It's the best stair animation I've ever seen in my life. In terms of music, there's not much memorable here, but it's definitely serviceable, with most tracks leaning into the generic thriller mold. The voice acting and sound effects, on the other hand, are wildly inconsistent, with some characters turning in great performances, and some noises sounding awesome, and others not so much. So that's Second Sight, an interesting diversion for Free Radical that ultimately ended up as a great idea that needed more time in the oven. A lot of people talk about this game like it's a hidden gem or forgotten classic, but for me, it's more of a valiant failure with amazing ideas and frustrating problems, all of which have not been helped by the passage of time and a very shaky PC port. Despite it all, part of me loves Second Sight, but the truth is, it's a deeply flawed game that even when it came out, had issues. I really wish we could have gotten a sequel, or even a remake, as I think there's tons of potential in the idea and this world. It's charming, interesting, and a big swing that deserves not to end here. Who knows? Maybe someday THQ Nordic and Free Radical will go back to it, right? Or maybe not.